How can we know the Gospels are historically reliable? Undesigned Coincidences provide just one of the many lines of support that help us to answer these questions with confidence.
No. Undesigned Coincidences cannot give us anything that would indicate that the Gospels are historically accurate. In fact, the argument from Undesigned Coincidences is intellectually bankrupt. If you want to fuck around and find out why Undesigned Coincidences can't prove that the Gospels are historically accurate and is an intellectually bankrupt argument, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. First, let me start off by enlightening y'all about why undesigned coincidences are just laughable. The whole argument requires a presumption that is in direct conflict with reality. That presumption would be the idea that the gospel writers didn't copy off each other. In order to use undesigned coincidences, they must either ignore the fact that the gospels are interdependent or just ad hoc state that the Gospels are independent works. Due to the fact that the Gospels are interdependent, that means that they cannot be used to elucidate anything about history. If something seems to fit between two Gospels, then it was most definitely designed to fit. One Gospel redacts another Gospel. This really isn't hard, but apologists love to cherry pick which facts of reality suit them.
What is an undesigned coincidence? Put plainly, a textual coincidence between the gospel accounts that's so mundane or theologically insignificant that it isn't explained by mythological storytelling or interpolation, but rather points in the direction of these accounts being actual eyewitness accounts.
Well, this presents a false dichotomy. He claims that mythological storytelling and interpolation are the only two possibilities other than the Gospels being independent pieces of work. He curiously leaves out the fact that all the Gospels copied off each other. Considering all of the evidence we have to support this fact, it's a big mistake. Considering the Synoptic Problem, one author redacting another author's work and changing it a little bit makes a lot more sense than independent attestation. In the context of the Gospels, undesigned coincidences can never give us anything that would point us towards thinking that they were eyewitness accounts. So he's just simply wrong about the impact and importance of undesigned coincidences. In fact, this entire argument was refuted back in the 19th century when it was initially proposed. Lydia and Tim McGrew are just the most recent apologists to resurrect this argument from the dead like it's gonna save their souls.
These undesigned coincidences are strong evidence for a few reasons. First, these are found within the text itself. Second, the evidence from undesigned coincidences would be difficult to fake, and it would be more unlikely to come about by sheer chance in a non-factual or manipulated story.
How exactly would it be more difficult to fake? If one author is copying off of another author and changing it around a little bit, how could it not fit together? This issue of the gospel authors copying off one another is typically referred to as the Synoptic Problem. But the problem has grown in recent years, considering that John's gospel has been shown to have used the other gospels as well to generate his story. So in this video, whenever I talk about the Synoptic Problem, I'm talking about all the gospels using each other to copy and produce new gospels. And the problem is easily solved when you admit that all the gospel authors did in fact have the other gospels to copy off of and use as material to generate their own gospels. I checked out how Lydia McGrew argues against the Synoptic Problem, and needless to say, it's less than convincing. In short, it doesn't matter to the historicity of the Gospels whether, for example, Mark was written first and Matthew and Luke got some of their material from Mark. Even if that is true, it doesn't mean that Matthew and Luke developed from Mark in an evolutionary fashion, or that Matthew and Luke did not have reliable, independent information of their own. So Lydia McGrew just makes up imaginary sources that we definitely don't have access to because they're imaginary, and she hand waves away the problem. She heavily relies on the possible, therefore probable fallacy. From what I can tell, Since it's possible that the gospel authors had their own independent sources of information, then that makes it plausible that they had their own independent sources of information. While I can't agree that it's possible there are independent sources behind the Gospels, it's not plausible given the current evidence that we have. All evidence that we have points to the Gospel authors only referring to other Gospels in order to generate their own Gospel. Also, I'd like to say that apologists seem to not understand what independent sources are. Because you see, when Matthew copies verbatim out of Mark, and then Luke also copies verbatim from both Matthew and Mark, you no longer have three different sources. You have one source. And Lydia does nothing to prove her point that there are independent sources behind the Gospels. She just falls on the possibility and then immediately states that it's plausible. And you simply can't do that with hypothetical sources. These are sources that she has created. There's no way to know what's in these sources, or even who wrote these sources, or why we should consider these sources to be independent. Not to mention that this whole approach seems to assume that the gospel authors were incapable of just making shit up. And that's a really important point to make here, because if you can't discern made-up stuff from real historical stuff, then that means your source is utterly useless. It's a completely ridiculous approach and is not how historians approach anything.
So this is bad news for people that are trying to say that the Gospels were developed over time. These are actually direct evidence against this thesis, for you wouldn't predict finding these things in different writings that are developed over time and interpolated over time.
Well, these coincidences are things that you would expect to find if one author was just copying or redacting another author. You would expect them to fit like puzzle pieces because one is copying off another and just changing things a little bit. Undesigned coincidences can't be bad news for us because the argument can't give us anything that would point to the Gospels as being independent accounts. Lydia just ad hoc states that the Synoptic Problem isn't an issue and that the Gospels, or rather their imaginary sources behind them, are independent. If you can't analyze these imaginary and completely made up sources, then you cannot state that they are independent. That's just how shit works.
With that being said, let's look at one of these undesigned coincidences. In Luke 23, 1-4, we read, "Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, 'We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king.' And Pilate asked him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' And he answered him, 'You have said so.' Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, 'I find no guilt in this man.'"
Well, this is ultimately derived from Mark's gospel. The trial of Jesus is never mentioned until Mark's gospel. Mark has Jesus completely silent at his trial before Pilate and the Sanhedrin due to a prophecy in Isaiah 53. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Isaiah 53:7. Also, it's kind of worth it to note here that there's literally no way that the gospel authors could have known what was said or wasn't said at the trial of Jesus before Pilate. I mean, maybe before the Sanhedrin, but definitely not before Pilate. There was nobody there to record the actions that occurred during that interaction. So it makes no sense to think that this is in any way historical. It's definitely only tied to scripture. But anyways, continuing on. Luke and John take this moment to expand upon this interaction between Pilate and Jesus. And it's quite odd to me that he starts out with Luke's gospel. In fact, every time I've encountered undesigned coincidences, it seems like the apologist never goes back to the source documentation for whatever they're about to talk about. Because every single time that I've mentioned undesigned coincidences, they start so much later in the gospel tradition that it's just ridiculous and laughable. Also, why wouldn't you expand upon the differences between all the gospel accounts here? Oh, wait, is it because if you did that, people would recognize how bullshit the story is? In any case, Mark's account is completely fictional and only serves to fulfill a prophecy. All subsequent instances of this trial before Pilate are ultimately based on Mark's account of the trial and are therefore not historical and only inspired by scripture. This is why just ignoring the synoptic problem, like Lydia McGrew wants you to do, is a serious issue. You have to literally ignore the fact that Luke got his information from previous Gospels, Matthew and Mark, and also the scriptures. This argument requires you to automatically assume that the Gospels are historical before you even start.
Jesus is being accused of sedition. Pilate asks Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" But what follows is interesting. Jesus does not reject the charge. He says, "It is as you say," treating it as an idiom like a modern American expression. You said it. Why has Pilate found no basis for a charge against him? Pilate asked him a direct question, and Jesus gave a seemingly snarky response. So what gives?
Well, let's get one thing straight. The Pilate in the Gospels is completely different than the historical Pilate. Sure, the historical Pilate would have killed Jesus for nothing, and so that doesn't really make sense with the story in the Gospels. You know what also doesn't make sense? The fact that Pilate allowed the Jews to push him around and execute Jesus when he didn't want to. So why on earth would the Gospels represent Pilate this way? Well, as with everything else in the Gospels, to fulfill Scripture. In Isaiah 53, 1 through 12, it states that his people wouldn't believe the Messiah and would kill the Messiah. The gospel writers have one goal in mind with the trial by Pilate, and that's to emphasize the role that the Jews played in the crucifixion of Jesus. They are the sole reason why Jesus was even killed in the story. That is the most parsimonious explanation for why the gospel Pilate is so radically different than the historical Pilate.
The answer lies within John's Gospel in John 18:33-38. Here we read, "So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' Jesus answered, 'Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?' Pilate answered, 'Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?' Jesus answered, 'My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world.' Then Pilate said to him, 'So you are a king?' Jesus answered, 'You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice.' Pilate said to him, 'What is truth?' After he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, 'I find no guilt in him.'"
Right? And how do you not understand that this was all done to emphasize the role that the Jews played in Jesus' death? Also, just a little side note here, John's gospel was most likely written in the 2nd century, and he had access to all the other gospels. The most glaring connection between John and the Synoptic Gospels is, in fact, Luke's gospel. L. Michael White in From Jesus to Christianity had this to say about this topic. John's many changes to the Synoptics may well have been made intentionally and with full awareness of the Synoptic tradition. Several features of the Johannine narrative seem to reflect such an awareness and use of the Synoptic tradition, including direct verbal similarities with distinctive linguistic formulations or narrative elements in Mark and Luke, respectively. For instance, John definitely inherited Mark's feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus' walking on the water miracles. The pairing and the sequence in John's gospel matches Mark's gospel, so the most likely explanation is just that John copied it from Mark. Like I said before, the strongest connection exists between John and Luke's gospel. John explicitly refutes a number of things that Luke creates with his gospel. The most damning example is the appearance of Lazarus in both gospels. Luke's Lazarus is a parable about how no miracle will be enough to get people to believe in the Messiah. John's author just totally yeets that idea out the window and creates a real Lazarus that really resurrects from the dead, and that event really does convert a lot of people to believing in Jesus. Both Luke and John also are the only ones that have Mary's sister Martha show up. Only Luke and John have 2 Judases in the list of disciples. Only Luke and John have Judas Iscariot being possessed by Satan. Only Luke and John have Pilate declare Jesus innocent 3 times, which is a magical number, by the way. And there are several more connections between Luke and John's gospel. It's insane to me to suggest that John, who had access to all the other gospels and actively used them to create his narrative, was now somehow relaying accurate historical eyewitness accounts, and that's all explained by undesigned coincidences. And just a point of fact here, a majority of scholars are coming around to the fact that John had access to all the other gospels, and he used all the other gospels to generate his gospel. So that literally makes this video on the fringe of scholarship. Now, I don't have a problem with that personally because, my position of mythicism is on the fringe of scholarship as well. But you would think for a group of apologists that regularly tout the majority opinion of biblical scholars, he would want to be on the side of the majority opinion.
So it is only after you read John's account that you learn that Jesus had told Pilate that, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." So John fills out the gaps in dialogue in Luke. Jesus affirms that he was born to be king, but he makes it clear that his kingdom is not of this world, that he is not encouraging the use of physical force to achieve his aims. Pilate concludes that he is a harmless religious crank of some sort, and it is in this fuller context that Pilate tells the Jewish leaders that he finds no guilt in Jesus.
This is exactly how you would try to reconcile conflicting descriptions of the same event. You would just cherry pick points and claim that they complement each other. What about the fact that Luke's author has Pilate shipping Jesus off to Herod Antipas because Jesus is Galilean? How exactly does this little bit factor into John's account? The one where this never occurs whatsoever? Luke's gospel not only has Pilate declaring Jesus to be innocent, but also Herod says that he's innocent. He just makes fun of him a little bit. How in the world do you reconcile this? The only way that I can really think about it is that you would use an invalid argument from silence here. Just because John doesn't talk about consulting Herod doesn't mean that he didn't consult Herod. That doesn't make a lick of sense. Pilate literally tells the crowd that not even Herod found fault with Jesus. That means that either one of these accounts is a liar, or they're both wrong because they're not reporting history. Another glaring difference is that John's Pilate has Jesus beaten and flogged before he finally declares him innocent for a 3rd time. That doesn't even happen in Luke. An argument from silence doesn't really work here because of the progression of events, and the dialogue are completely different. You cannot reconcile these 2 accounts by ignoring how different they are.
But there's also another intriguing feature related to this passage. Why, in John's account, does Pilate even ask Jesus whether he is a king? We learn the answer in Luke 23:2. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." The allegation which is made in Luke's gospel is not recorded in John's. So we can see how the 2 accounts, when put together, form the full picture.
Well, internally to the story, this seems like a logical conclusion for Pilate. The Jews apparently couldn't convict and kill Jesus, and the only reason why that would be the case is if Jesus was somehow above their own law. I'm not sure if this is the intended case, but it's far more plausible than John reporting historical events that he obviously copied off somebody else. Or maybe John's author felt that everybody already knew that Jesus was called the king, and so he didn't feel the need to repeat himself there. Both of these possibilities are far more plausible than undesigned coincidences.
We have an accusation of sedition, Pilate's question, Jesus' answer that he is a king but not a king of the world, and Pilate's conclusion that he is not guilty in the eyes of Roman law. So these accounts are not contradictory but complementary.
They are only complementary if you ignore all the evidence that points towards the fact that they are not. How can John's gospel be complementary when he's explicitly writing his gospel to refute ideas in the other gospels? Specifically Luke's. John's author, for whatever reason, decided to change the trial by Pilate. Most likely it's to put way more emphasis on the Jews' role in Jesus' crucifixion. Also, John's author removes Herod Antipas from the entire account. The dialogue between both Luke and John's account of the trial are completely different. How can you consider these to be complementary when they're so vastly different? Well, all in all, I am not impressed with this video whatsoever. I continue to be disappointed by Undesigned Coincidences. What this video does a really good job of is exposing the intellectual bankruptcy of this argument. The fact that you have to ignore the synoptic problem or just outright declare that it's not a problem whatsoever because of imaginary sources highlights how intellectually bankrupt it is. The interdependence of the Gospels is the mainstream view of reasonable historians and biblical scholars. Now, I don't think that fact alone makes it better, but for people who regularly tout out the fringeness of mythicism, you would think that they would want to reject similarly fringe ideas. Seems like they only reject the fringe positions they already disagree with, and they readily accept the fringe positions that they already believe. Well, heathens, that's it for me today. I hope that you will go down below and let me know in the comments what you guys thought about Exploring Reality's video. Do you think they had some good points in it, or do you think that Undesigned Coincidences are intellectually bankrupt and you guys just need to fucking stop using them right the fuck now? And hey, while you're down there, why don't you go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.